We begin this series on the Old Testament with an overview of the Old Testament, and then we'll go through each section of books as are laid out in mostly in the order that we find them in the Protestant Christian Bible. The Old Testament is sometimes a scary place and a scary set of books to begin with. It's filled with archaic language and weird commands, and it covers an expansive history of Israel. It goes from the beginning of the world, as the Israelites see it, and ends around 500 BCE. But the Old Testament is a significant resource for Christian, Jews, and Muslims. It connects all three monotheistic religions and provides significant leaps in philosophical debate from animism, the belief that everything has a spirit, into monotheism, believing there is only one God. Before we dive deeper into the ideas of the Old Testament, let's unpack what the Old Testament is. Depending on the tradition you've come from, there are three different versions of the Old Testament. The Jewish understanding, which is the law, the prophets, and the writings, which does not separate out Samuel or Kings into two separate books, but are combined into a unified book. The Protestant Christian version of the Old Testament, which would break it up into four sections: the Pentateuch, the first five books, history, prophets, and wisdom, and the Catholic view, which breaks up the Old Testament similar to Protestant Christians, but adds the Apocrypha, which adds books such as the Maccabees, the Wisdom of Sirach, Edith, Tobit, and Baruch. For our purposes, as we are Protestant, we'll begin focusing on the Protestant version of the Old Testament, and the next videos will be broken down by those categories, starting with the first five books. Before we can go further, we must discuss some of the importance of the Old Testament, its place in history, the people who would have written the Old Testament, and so on. So first, let's begin with history and people. The Old Testament is written by various authors throughout history, and in the case of Genesis, probably has about 5 different people editing and changing the text. The majority of the Old Testament is written by 4 different groups of people. The first is those of the anonymous authors. Scholars have no idea who wrote Joseph's story or who wrote Solomon's succession to king in Israel. The second category, collectors and compilers of existing texts. These people would have gathered written works already in existence and compiled them into an order that made sense. This is evident in Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 26. The third category is that of editors or redactors. These people would have taken word-of-mouth stories and put them down on text and writing new segments and supplements to create whole new sections. This is probably the case for Genesis and Exodus. The last category is scribes and scholars, who meticulously preserved the approved text from generation to generation. The Old Testament, as we know it, was created and written, and some of the earliest portions probably date back to the 10th century and Israel's early monarchy. Other portions written during the 9th, 8th, 7th, and 6th century, from the second half of Israel's monarchy to the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. In exile, more sections of the Old Testament were developed and added after the exile in 539 BCE. The final pieces were added in that section of exile. Let's dive into the world of the Old Testament. The world of the Old Testament is centered around 3 areas, and a general area that is called the Fertile Crescent. These 3 areas where the Old Testament is centered upon is Mesopotamia, Canaan, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. The origin of humanity for the writers of the Old Testament begins in Mesopotamia, and the specific story of Abraham brings in Mesopotamia in a place called Ur, which would have been the major population center in the 3rd millennium. This is most likely when Abraham leaves his family and continues to head towards Canaan. That city suffers a disastrous destruction around 2000 BCE, and this is where we see the story of Abraham start taking place, approximately. Abraham leaves his family and continues to head west towards Canaan. Abraham and his family spend a lot of time in Canaan as nomadic shepherds raising animals. About a full generation is raised in that time. And they go to cities such as Jerusalem, Bethel, and Jericho. And then with the Joseph story, the location changes. And where the Israelites spend about 400 years in Egypt, and the story centers around Egypt. Once Moses arrives on the scene, he takes the Israelites from that area of Egypt called Goshen and moves them back into Canaan, and they wander the wilderness in that time period. The Israelites then take over Canaan and struggle against the indigenous people for control of the land. When finally the Israelites, when they coalesce under a single monarchy, that of Saul, and the united tribes and create a firm border, and David expands those borders and Solomon rules over those expanded boundaries. After the split of the monarchy into north and south, the Israelites then are sent back into exile. We revisit Mesopotamia with the northern tribes being located in the land of Assyria and the southern tribes being located in Babylon in southern Mesopotamia. This is the world of the Old Testament. It's a place you can visit today, but the majority of Israel's old history in the Old Testament happens in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The significant developments of faith happen in those places. The key thing to know about Canaan, as it needs to be explained, is that Canaan serves as a land bridge in between multiple powerful enemies. And this is where the powers of the ancient world would collapse or clash. And so you have Egypt south of Canaan, you have Babylon east of Canaan, and you have Assyria northeast of Canaan, and the Hittites and the Greeks to the northwest of Canaan. And so if these people were attacking one another, they would go through Canaan and usually take over Canaan. So Canaan has a long history of flipping back and forth in between massive superpowers of the ancient world. The major importance of the Old Testament is its philosophical and religious ponderings. A major impact of the Old Testament is that of monotheism. However, the reality of the Old Testament is up until really late in the story, they aren't explicitly monotheistic. It does state that Israel's God is the only God for Israel. As time goes on, though, the Old Testament writers no longer assume there are other gods and talk only about the God of Israel. Monotheism is one of the lasting ideas of the Old Testament. It's an important cultural landmark, and it has had lasting impact on the rest of the world. Not only that, but a lot of our understanding and information about who God is and what He desires in the world is found in the Old Testament. There is a lot of history and scholarship that has gone into understanding the Old Testament. We could talk about the Old Testament probably for hours. But it's important to begin here with an overview about the Old Testament. If you want to know more about the resources that I use to make these videos, there will be descriptions in the links below. And I hope that you take the time to explore more.